So today we are talking about the brand new Canon EOS R, which isn't even out on the market now. Just for the record, I went to Hawaii. We actually filmed the launch video. This video itself is not sponsored, so I'm telling you guys exactly how I feel about it. There are gonna be a lot of review videos that are gonna be popping up, so I'm gonna switch things around. I'm gonna tell you how this is gonna work for our channel and our team, the pros and cons, what I love about it, what I don't love about it as much. When I was in Hawaii, I shot a ton of test footage. I shot 3 days filming nonstop of test footage for you guys. Now, big things for me with this camera is autofocus. Canon is claiming it is the best or one of the best autofocus cameras out there. Now, for video stuff, we haven't really used autofocus a lot just because I haven't been super impressed with it. So I'm gonna show you some shots just straight from the start, how this camera does with autofocus. Now, most of what you're seeing as we speak right now was shot with the brand new Canon 50mm 1.2 lens. So I am shooting wide open, walking into our subject, our models, walking all the way back, and as you see, 95% of the time, it is perfect focus. Even while I'm shooting this interview right now, I'm gonna walk towards you guys. Ta-da. And now I'm gonna let's push it a little further and walk a little bit closer to you guys. But I'm super blown away by the autofocus. This is something that we're gonna use a ton on. Now, the big thing with this camera is Canon's claiming is it is their first full frame mirrorless camera. Not their first mirrorless camera, but their full frame mirrorless camera. For me, the biggest downside, I hate talking about the downsides right at the start, but the biggest pro for me is the autofocus is absolutely incredible. Biggest con for me is it does 4K, yes, but only up to 30 frames per second. It does not do 4K at 60 frames per second, which for me is a big deal. All the stuff you're seeing right now, I shot it at 1080p at 60 frames per second, all this slow motion stuff, and then I upscaled it to 4K. You'll actually notice if you click down there, there is a button to watch it in 4K. For me, when I'm looking to a camera, investing in a camera, and especially if you're gonna be spending $2,300, which is what this camera costs, you're gonna wanna know how the image actually does. So I'm just gonna show you guys a bunch of test footage right now. Let's get started. Canon had a lot of different booths set up. One of them was a bunch of fruit, so that's what you're seeing right now. Now, this was covered in a kiosk, but the open was all lit by natural light. This is me walking with the glide cam, shooting at 1080p at 60 frames per second. This is me walking in, kind of pushing into the subject, and then walking out. Now, I'm using the touchscreen. I'm tapping where I want to be in focus, then I'm walking forward, and then backwards, just to show you guys an example of how well it actually pulls focus. Now, the next thing you're gonna see is how well does it pull focus on people's faces, because that's mostly what we're shooting. So here they had a bunch of different models set up. I clicked on their eye and I walked in. This is all at a 1.2 at a 50mm, which that's one of the hardest lenses to pull focus. And then I'm walking backwards. Then I also tested it with them walking towards me and then walking away from me, as we just saw a second ago. So let's talk about the pros right now. Big thing for me, as I already pointed out, is the autofocus is absolutely incredible. Canon also, with this new full frame mirrorless camera, they introduced a series of brand new lenses. These lenses are incredible. I want to say they are of their kind as far as their size. They are one of the sharpest, if not the sharpest lenses out there. I am making that claim, especially with the 50mm and the 28 to 70mm. Those lenses are so sharp, super clean. And as you guys can see with the footage right now, I think it looks incredibly amazing. And a lot of the stuff is at 1080p and it still looks just as clean as anything you'd expect from like these big, heavy cinema lenses, but super impressed with that. Now, one of the biggest complaints I've seen about people comparing this camera to other things is it only has one card slot. For us, it doesn't matter. A lot of the times I'll get confused on what card I had in there, so I'll have to kind of pop one out. It's like, oh, I didn't actually record in that one, I recorded in this one, and I have to go back and forth. I know a lot of wedding photographers love this feature as far as like switching in and out or having all your cards already in there. For what we do, I prefer one card slot. It doesn't really make a big difference for me, so that's not a selling point for me. This is our first time dealing with mirrorless cameras. It was a brand new world for me. This is one thing I actually struggled with at first, because when you look through the viewfinder as if you're taking a photo, and on the back of the screen, everything you're seeing is a digital LCD screen. So you're not seeing it exactly how it is compared to if you had a 5D Mark IV, you look through the viewfinder, or any DSLR camera for that matter, is you're seeing it exactly how it is. Now, with that being said, is when you look through that LCD finder, it looks super clear, but that was just something I wasn't completely used to. Now, one kind of big bragging thing about the mirrorless cameras is when you take a photo, it is completely silent. You don't hear a clicker, you don't hear the shutter going off. I love hearing the shutter going off, but for a lot of wedding photographers where you want to be as quiet as possible, you want to be as silent as possible. And that's one thing that's really big about the mirrorless cameras, is they can take pictures completely silent. They're using the exact same sensor as a Canon 5D Mark IV. They have different processors going on, so they can actually process it a lot faster, but it has the same sensor. I've always loved the Canon 5D Mark IV sensor. Another big thing that Canon has been talking about is the multi-function bar that you're gonna see on the back of the camera. It's on the top right. The one thing with this is you can preset all your buttons, or at least most of your buttons on your camera. For this one, they want you to program different things, like for example, ISO, shutter. Just with the slide of a finger, it's all touch bar, so I can change all that. I can program it to what I think is gonna make the biggest difference. This is a new feature for me, a little bit out of my kind of the way my brain processes it, so I actually never turn that feature on. But I know some people, they've talked about one thing that was a downside for it on accident as they're taking pictures with the ISO. All of a sudden they jumped up the ISO on accident. So that's why I was afraid to kind of use that feature. But I know that's something that Canon's really excited about. And they're talking about just because that is a new feature that you haven't seen in a lot of cameras. So definitely take a look at that. Now you'll notice on the camera itself, on the back next to the viewfinder, there's a little sensor there. What happens is the second you put your face to that sensor, because it thinks you're looking through the viewfinder, it turns off the video screen, which is super smart. Now the second you move your face away from that viewfinder, that disappears. So that can be a little frustrating for people when, let's just say, you're not necessarily looking through it, but let's just say someone moves their hand by that sensor, all of a sudden that screen is going to go off and you're trying to get a shot. That can be very frustrating. So that is something you can turn off in the camera settings. This camera uses the same batteries that the Canon 5D Mark IV uses, Mark III, Mark II. So you're not having to throw away all your batteries. We're using the exact same batteries we've used for the last 6-7 years with these kind of cameras. I was curious, like, is this going to suck up a lot more battery? I was filming all day and I didn't have to change the battery once. So that was another thing I was super impressed with. And I wasn't leaving the camera running 24/7, but I did get a bunch of footage and the battery lasted all day. And near the end of the day, I was almost at the end of my battery, but it worked great. Super impressed with the battery life. I had 2 batteries. I did charge it every night, but I never had to like worry or stress about it. The new EOS lenses, they have a extra ring on the front or on the back of the lens, depending on where you're looking at it. And you can program that to set it to aperture, other different settings that you want in the camera. That's not a feature that I'm used to, so I didn't program it, but I think for aperture, that's gonna be a big deal for photographers and videographers. To sum up everything, how is this camera going to fit into Team Supertramp? Will it replace the Canon 5D Mark IV? For our behind the scenes, yes. I would say from now on, this is the camera that we're going to buy, and that all our behind the scenes videos are going to be shot on this camera right here. Now, photography, if I was only going out just to take photos, I would bring my Canon 5D Mark IV because I prefer that I can actually see exactly what it is, just because I'm more of an old school photographer as far as that goes. But there's not a whole lot of times, because I focus on the moving image, where I really need a DSLR. So that's where the mirrorless camera is going to stand up there. If you know anything about camera releases, usually they start small and then within a couple years, if not within a year, they release the higher end things. So I think Canon is fully capable of having a mirrorless full frame that can do 60 frames per second, but I think that's going to come with the next camera that we see. So that's kind of a con about it all, but it is what it is. Now, one other issue I have with the camera is whenever you shoot 4K, going from 1080p to 4K, there is a 1.7 crop. I'm gonna show you guys an example right now that I shot in Hawaii. It's actually a plant that is extinct everywhere in the world with the exception of Maui. This plant right here, I'm shooting at 1080p. The second I turn it to 4K, 24 frames per second, you're cropping in by 1.7. So you're losing a lot of that width. So for someone like me that loves these big wide angle shots, I'm losing a ton of information. So that's why a lot of the stuff that you're seeing, I was shooting at 1080p 1.8 just because I love those wider shots. Now, a lot of people are gonna say, well, that sucks, that's the worst thing to happen. It's not ideal by any means, but the one pro is what Canon has done is they have an adapter where you can use all of your old Canon EF lenses. So for someone like me, the 11-24 f4 is one of my all-time favorite lenses. I can put this adapter on and I can put it on this camera and I can get these wide angle shots. It's still cropping with 4K, but it's still a lot wider than what you're seeing right now. The other big deal with this camera is the flip screen. Now, I had actually never worked with a flip screen until this shoot. That was my first time using it. At first, I wasn't sure how I was gonna feel about it. I absolutely loved it, especially for this world right now that we live in where everyone is a vlogger and doing selfies. This is a great camera as far as capturing photos where you can have the viewfinder pop out and you can see exactly what you are seeing. So for me, massive plus, and the camera feels super sturdy. Canon has the option to shoot in Canon C-Log, which makes the color space absolutely incredible. And that records 8-bit, but I can plug my camera into something like an Atmos and I can record 10-bit. So the slip and slide video that you saw out of the airplane, all the shots were filming more in the lower light. We were trying to shoot as much as we could as far as in the airplane. That was at 10-bit because it gave us a lot more information. Sometimes we couldn't hook up like a big external monitor. You don't want all those extra attachments as someone's falling through the sky. That's why we did that way. But that 10-bit is a big deal. We tested it. We had a lot of stuff where we shot in our office where it was really dark in certain areas. And definitely when you're shooting in 10-bit, you have a lot more information to make it look that much better. So once again, that is another big deal for us. The Canon 11-24mm, I'm saying that lens specifically because that's what I use mostly. That lens is so wide that you can't put on an attachment as far as on the lens itself, as far as an ND filter, a polarizer. So with Canon's new mounts that they've made for this camera, I can put in an ND, a variable ND, so I can change the ND on there. And I can also put a polarizer inside of that mount so I can change the ND, the polarizer, so I can get exactly what I want. Until this moment in time, I haven't had that option. So for me, that is a big deal, once again, that I'm really excited about. So there you have it. That is my thoughts on the Canon EOS R, on how Team Supertramp is going to be using it. The one things that will replace as far as our main videos go, it's a lot easier to hook this camera onto someone's head compared to a big red camera. It's an incredible secondary camera that we can use to cut with footage. With the red, I think it will cut just fine. And as far as behind the scenes stuff, or vlogging for that matter, anything we do within that world, this is a camera that will be replacing our Canon 5D Mark IV. The Canon 5D Mark IV, we're not selling it, we're not throwing it away, we're still going to be using that. I think the image is incredible. That's more of behind the scenes as far as photography and stuff like that goes. But we don't have to replace any of our lenses with this new camera. So super stoked for that. There you have it. Any questions you guys have, leave them down below in the comments. We're going to do our best through this comment thread to answer those questions. As we always say, over and out.